Despite more and more players moving towards combo-based strategies, there certainly have been a ton of really fun and really viable back row decks over the past couple of years. The problem though is that many of the trap cards in those decks seem to fall into one of two categories. They're either older generic cards like Compulse or Solemns or Floodgates and something along those lines, or they're newer cards that are actually good trap cards but they only work in one theme, like the Eldritch trap cards or any other number of archetype traps. There are of course exceptions to this, but in general we get like 1 or 2 really good generic trap cards per year, and that's pretty much it. Evenly Matched, for example, is a great trap card that a lot of back row decks use to break boards going second, but that card is from 3 years ago. A year later in 2018 you pretty much just had Infinite Impermanence and Trap Trick, and then in 2019 you had Crackdown. While these are not the only generic trap cards released over the past several years, they are some of the ones that saw the most amount of play, and pretty much all of them are going to be good in some back row based strategy. I suppose I should also count Red Reboot because that is a trap card that has seen success. However, that one is more good against back row decks, not so much in them, so it's not really a good generic trap card that most back row decks would want to play. Admittedly, I had high hopes for that Lost Wind 2.0 card that I had reviewed a while ago, but in practice that card actually ended up being worse than Lost Wind, which was a real shame. So as far as recent releases go, there have not been that many good generic trap cards that actually have seen competitive success, despite the fact that plenty of back row decks are still seeing at least rogue play, like Altergeist and Guru and even Paleozoics. Obviously decks like Eldritch use trap cards, but those are all theme trap cards. They're part of the archetype. When it comes to generic trap cards that people want to be able to use in their back row based strategies, it's been sort of rough over the past couple of years. And I really wanted to give that context because it really explains why this new reveal that we got yesterday out of Phantom Rage is so important. Basically, Warning Point is a new generic trap card that could be played in a lot of decks, and this thing, in my opinion, is unbelievably strong. If you're one of the people that thought that Dimensional Barrier should be updated to include link summoning, you're probably going to enjoy Warning Point quite a bit. It is different than Dimensional Barrier. It's not just the exact same thing, but both of them do share a lot of similarities, so I think that people will naturally compare them, and I'll do that in today's video as well. First off, what does this card do? So Warning Point is a normal trap card out of Phantom Rage, and it says when a monster or monsters is summoned this turn, that face-up monster or monsters cannot attack. Its effects are negated. Also, it cannot be used as material for a fusion, synchro, exceeds, or link summon. So basically, I think a lot of people look at this card and say, well, it's a targeted Dimensional Barrier, and that does make some sense, but it actually has a lot of advantages that Dimensional Barrier does not have. In my mind, when I read Warning Point, I more so compared it to no material, but also with an added benefit of the monster not being able to attack and also negating its effects. And those added benefits are pretty huge. Obviously, there is a downside here. It is a trap card, and trap cards aren't in the best spot right now, but this card is extremely valuable for any back row based strategy. What makes this card so special is that sometimes the added benefit will be that attack negation and effect negation, and sometimes the added benefit will be that the monster cannot be used as material for all those summons. If there's one thing that I've learned over the years of playing back row decks, it's that flexibility is king. This card is so good because it does so many different things in different situations. Whenever you're playing a back row based deck, you want cards that are good in as many situations as possible. Solemn Judgment, for example, is pretty much always good. Solemn Strike is pretty much always good. Even something like Compulsory is almost always going to be playable against any deck that uses extra deck monsters. But even if your opponent isn't using extra deck monsters, you can still use it to recycle your own cards. It's very, very versatile. One of the problems with that last like Lost Wind 2.0 card is that it wasn't very versatile, and that's why a lot of people didn't play it. With this card though, you don't have to use it against a card that your opponent is trying to use as material. For example, if your opponent summons Inspector Border and you have a Multi-Faker in hand, well, now you can Warning Point the Inspector Border, resolve the Multi-Faker, special summon Silk, and bounce the border back to their hand. Maybe your opponent summons Chaos Dragon Levianeer, and then you can use your Warning Point to stop its effect from blowing up your entire field. Yeah, you could use Dimensional Barrier to prevent it from being used for a rank 8 monster, but who really cares about that? This card not only prevents it from being used as material for anything, but also it prevents its effect from happening. Oh, and also, just for good measure, the card can't attack. This one trap card pretty much just completely invalidated a very powerful card and plenty of others, and that is one of the reasons why it's so useful, because it doesn't only have to be used against cards that your opponent wanted to use as material, but it's also good against cards where not only do you want to negate their effect, but also you want to prevent them from being used as material for different summons. Alistair the Invoker is a great example. That card has a very powerful on-summon effect of Searching Invocation, and also your opponent wants to use it for Link material and Fusion material, and if you flip this one card, not only does your opponent not get the search, but also they don't get to use it as material. I mean, this has always sort of been a struggle, right? Do you want to negate the effect? Well, your opponent's probably just going to use it for material. Do you want to prevent a monster from being used as material with Dimensional Barrier? Well, now they can still use the effect. No material obviously does stop your opponent from using the monster as material for anything, but the main problem there is that you have to control no cards to use it, which is a pretty big downside, especially after turn 1. Just like Dimensional Barrier though, this card is also very good against things like Pendulum Summons or Numeron Network summoning a bunch of monsters, because it does say monsters in parentheses there. It means that it will affect all the monsters that are summoned at the same time. That is a pretty big deal, because Numeron Network is likely going to be one of the best cards over the next couple of months. It was recently released out of Battles of Legend, of course, just a couple days ago, and it is one of the most hyped cards from that set. Versatility is the key here. You want to have a card that is good in as many situations as possible, and as good as it is in some matchups, Dimensional Barrier is simply not flexible enough for modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Mostly because it doesn't include Link summoning in its parentheses. If that was the case, I mean, that card would be insanely overpowered and probably banned at this point, but as it stands right now, yeah, it's not very good against Link summoning. I don't know how much you guys have played with Dimensional Barrier, but basically Dimensional Barrier has always been best against Pendulum monsters more so than any other mechanic. The reason is that Pendulum monsters are main deck monsters, which means when you use that Dimensional Barrier on Pendulums, not only does it stop their big summoning combos, but also negates all their effects. While not quite on the same level of power as Dimensional Barrier calling Pendulums, this thing is very, very close. I mean, the monster that you hit with this thing is pretty much useless for the entire turn. Its effects are negated, it can't attack, it can't be used as material for any of your opponent's extra deck summons. It's pretty much just sitting on the field, and your opponent can't really do anything with it until the effect wears off. And that is a huge deal for back row based strategies. Many back row decks like Altergeist, they really are just trying to stall their opponent for one turn and then set up their big board. Maybe decks like Paleozoics and Guru Control are not necessarily the exact same, but especially in Altergeist, you really do want to just stun your opponent for one turn and then combo off on your next turn. What's especially surprising about Warning Point is that it's not a hard once per turn. Now obviously with the first copy, it doesn't really matter if it's a hard once per turn or not. It has no recycling ability, but this means if you open multiple copies like you can with Compulse or Solemns, it means you actually can use all of them, which is a huge deal. One of the biggest drawbacks of any trap card that is a hard once per turn in a back row based strategy is that if you open multiples, they just sit there. They do basically nothing. And when you're playing a back row based deck, you need all of your cards to be live if possible. You want them all to be playable. So with Warning Point, it is very, very important that the card is not a hard once per turn effect. Certainly you can have good hard once per turn effects that are on trap cards, but it is extremely valuable to any back row based player to have Warning Point not be a hard once per turn. The card is also not even that bad going second. No, it's not going to be as strong as like Compulse, for example, but that card's obviously really good going first or second. Where Warning Point can come in handy though is if your opponent tries to negate one of your effects. In that case, you could chain Warning Point as chain link 2 to prevent your effect from being negated while negating their effect, and also to prevent that monster from attacking, which could save you from being OTK'd that turn. As is pretty much the case with like 90% of trap cards, you want to draw them when you're going first, but I think that it's always worth mentioning when a card like this one is actually also halfway decent going second. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching today's video talking about yet another another release from Phantom Rage. Like I keep saying video after video after video, this really is shaping up to be one of my favorite sets ever released in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, especially in modern times. There are so many unique effects in this set for different archetypes and good generic cards like this one. I just really cannot wait for this set to be released in the TCG. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.